Welcome everyone to this first morning edition of Open Dialogues. And thank you all for joining. We're going to give a couple of minutes to let a few more people come in. It would be great if you could put in the chat where you're calling from and what really drew you to this conversation. And if I can maybe, sorry, Antony, I'm going to steal this from you. If what drew you was the uncertainty or the risk, it would be great for you to share in the chat which one is riding with priority in your head today. And please feel free to use the chat throughout to share provocations and thoughts. I think we can give it 2 more minutes. Haven't seen anything in the chat. Uncertainty front and center. Nice to hear, Gregory. Well, good to hear. Well, actually, I don't even know. I'm not certain what it is, but yearning for semantics. Wow. That's so fascinating. Uncertainty, Rod. So anybody else, please feel free to put that in the chat. Oh, I'm so envious of you and Rafis on the end, Michelle. Melissa. Uncertainty and risk. So both of them. Great. I'm going to keep letting people in, but I'm going to hand over to Jerry to get us started. And please, as I said, use the chat all the way through for comments or questions or provocations. Jerry, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining. It's great to have a different time and perhaps a very new audience. Some of you I don't think have participated in our chats before. My job is very simple. It's to introduce the idea and not to get into the detail of the 2 speakers, Antony Malmo and Nicola Robins, who are going to get at it very quickly. I just wanted to bring to your attention 2 quick things. One is that we really are interested in your input, and therefore please put your input in the chat, and also please don't hesitate to get involved. We'll have a conversation that goes for about half an hour, and then they'll open it up themselves to you, and we really want to hear from you. So please make sure we do hear your voices and how you take this thing. I'm Jerry Salol. I'm basically also going to tell you, go and look at this glossary that we have just launched, which is a toy we have created for us to start interrogating terminology that we use very, very easily, but sometimes misunderstand each other when we're using it. And so this is really an invitation to you to get involved, to add new words, to interrogate what we've put in there, and to question it. But having said that, I want to just go straight to Antony and Nicola and hand it over to them. They will open it up themselves when they're ready to do so. Welcome. You know what the provocation is. We're living in a time of great uncertainty. And over to you guys. And introduce yourselves if you want.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, I won't actually go into much in terms of introductions, what have you. You can always have a look at that and Google. I'm not sure if you feel the same way, Nicola, other than the fact that you wrote a great book.
Thank you.
Well, if we start where all this kicked off, Tamsin put something on LinkedIn, which was the World Economic Forum risk guide, which I love. I look at that every year, and it has nice maps where everything's connected. And then, but at the same time, there's a lovely page where they rank them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Show how they change. And I had responded to that, which is a growing thing that I have around the uncertainty space. And I think the discovery of a book by King and Kay called Radical Uncertainty, both highly credentialed individuals in economics and something else. Later on, Roger Spitzer's work from the Roger Spitzer's work, he calls it deep uncertainty. And at its core, they're both reviving this idea that goes all the way back to about the 1920s called Knightian uncertainty. And what it says is that, you know, there are uncertainties out there that we simply cannot calculate. Now, I spend a lot of time around mathematical statistician types, and they love to talk about risk and uncertainty being two sides of the same coin. And regular risk and uncertainty, that's true, but in deep uncertainty, there simply lacks, there are too many unknowns going on, and there are too many interacting forces. And of course, if you're familiar with complex adaptive systems and all of this, then you know that, you know, things operate in a non-linear fashion. They have cascading effects on one another, and we simply cannot connect. We simply cannot calculate them. And I have a thing, and there's a bit of a backstory there too, which we may or may not get into, but there is this idea, I have this sneaking suspicion, and I see it a lot in work with leadership teams and what have you, that we use things like risk maps, or we use calculations of risk. And one of the lovely things about calculations of risk is that they provide us with a sense that we actually know what the risk will be. And if you're measuring something inside of a silo, fine. But if you're measuring into systemic crossover, cascading risks and things that can take place in the real world, which is what we all actually live in at scale, suddenly the uncertainty, I think we enter into that space of deep or radical uncertainty. And so for me, it's a really fascinating area, but I think my other contention there is I am trying to figure out, is it human nature that we simply don't like, we want to minimize surprises? The brain is a prediction machine, and we want to reduce uncertainty in our world. Or could it be that we've been largely conditioned in this way, possibly since the Industrial Revolution and the growth of science? We've, at least us in the North, those of you who come from a North Atlantic background, North Atlantic cultures, we have a sense of we can math it out. We will be able to have command and control at some degree and figure it out. So, I mean, that's kind of my take on it. But I'm interested from Nicola's perspective in the indigenous knowledge space as to whether or not there are other ways that we can be better at living with and operating in deep uncertainty. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Antony. And it's great. I'm really enjoying the comments already, so please carry on. So I don't come and I don't hang out with people who do math and stuff very much at all, really. So I'm a practitioner, so I do hang out in business. But I'm trained in two very different practitioner modalities. So the one is in sustainability, and that's the business side. And the other one is in something called Ngoma practice, which is a Southern African system. It's shared across large parts of Africa. And it's relatively recent. It's only been around for a couple of thousand years, although it draws on much older animist traditions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a little bit from that tradition. to try and kind of set up in a way a contrast to what Antony speaks about. And when I talk about deep uncertainty, for me, very much it marks that difference between what we might call transition, a nice ordered change from here to there, and rupture, when that ordered change becomes frankly impossible. Because in rupture, we have a situation when things crack. And when things start cracking, the past tends to bubble up through the cracks. And that's when the risk becomes more systemic, like Antony said, more complex, less intelligible. They become inherently unpredictable. And it's kind of what we can feel now. And although it feels like this is unprecedented, rupture itself is not unprecedented in human experience. There have been times of rupture. And so different cultures have developed different ways to manage this and respond to it. So this is a brief perspective from Ngoma cultures. I think the one thing to say about these cultures is that these are not small bands of hunter-gatherers. These are people who accumulate surplus and manage wealth. They ran trade networks across Africa, historically to India and to China, and they scaled to the level of empire. So they're building surplus, they're managing wealth, and that always brings a new level of risk. Like rats in a granary. I just plowed over the neighbor's ancestor's grave. There's looting, there's jealousy, there's conflict, what we might call unintended consequences. This has been going on for a long time, certainly several millennia. So what did Ngoma culture or Ngoma people do to manage these unintended consequences, to manage this uncertainty? What do their tools look like? Well, it's an oral culture. So the tools don't live in spreadsheets, but they do live in the collective mind. If you want to look at risk, it's not detected by expert consultants alone. It's detected by the collective body. So experts, if there is an expert, it is the person who is able to work with that collective more effectively, perhaps, than someone else. And I'll just name 3 tools, just very quickly, that I think helped Ngoma people navigate uncertainty or deep uncertainty, and I think they still do. They are, firstly, spirits, an understanding of spirits, secondly, divination, and thirdly, ritual. And we have got people on the call who can definitely speak to all of those, in many cases more than I can. So, I mean, interestingly enough, these still form the basic syllabus for Ngoma training today in Southern Africa. Just briefly on spirits, if we are part of an animist culture, literally the world around us is alive. Everything can have a vital spirit. And also, we don't presume to know what spirits think. So there's always a bit of uncertainty. Certainly in much of Africa, a little bit of fear, perhaps, because spirits expect things from us. If I contrast that with maybe complexity science, we'll talk about agency being distributed, highly distributed. In complexity and deep complexity, we cannot predict the future. We can't map linear cause and effect. That's what Antony was saying. It's too entangled. It's too messy. So with spirits, a little bit like that. Ngoma people might say, the spirits are everywhere like water. They are everywhere like water. So this agency is fluid. We don't get to put it in categories and deal with things one by one like we love to do. This is why we can't create neat lists. So if we take climate change, we can't solve it alone, because what matters is how climate change interacts with poverty, with corruption, unemployment, biodiversity decline, with geopolitics, because that's where the agency lies. It lies in the interactions. And in many respects, I think Donald Trump has done us a huge favor here, because I think everyone is very clear about how difficult things become in reality. Okay, that's the first tool, which is about spirits. And that brings us to the second, which is divination. Aha, you say, divination is about predicting the future, and we know we can't do that in deep uncertainty. And of course, you're quite right. But traditional African divination was never about prediction. Divination traditionally used representation to create a dynamic map of an issue or a situation. That word dynamic is really important. So in this process of African divination, we have things being represented by other things, very common. So we have a random scattering of bones, of shells, of seeds, of dice, of old coins, all kinds of stuff that people gather together, and it's random. Or it's organized by the spirits themselves. We throw them literally. And then people gather around and look at the patterns. And what they're doing is they're making sense in uncertainty together. So traditional African divination was always a social act, carefully held together by a diviner. But it's not a thing of expertise when we rely on someone who knows the lists or the math better than we do. And the third tool is ritual. Ritual, we don't often use the word these days, I think, but it's a structured change technology. That's probably the best way to describe it in today's terms. Over time, ritual gets honed for reliability. People are highly pragmatic in the context of uncertainty, where things are going wrong potentially. So highly reliable because it's been honed exactly for that on feedback. So a simple ritual might be literally, you put a particular cloth around your shoulders every time you talk to the ancestors. What you're going to do is you'll create an unconscious association in your mind, and the association itself carries agency. So that's partly how it works. I mean, that's trying to take a view on it from a more North Atlantic perspective. Complex ritual, very carefully designed process, often organized in fractal form. It can force what we might in complexity science call emergence. It's going to do something that we didn't expect, always. Not exactly predictable, but something that moves in the direction we want it to. And this becomes critically important in a time of great risk or uncertainty, because it has to interfere, if you like, with our desire for things to be neat and easy, because it isn't. And I think that's really what makes it's useful. And it's there in that sense that we are very different to other animals. We are truly ritual specialists. And that means because of the degree to which we extract and to which our technologies make that more and more possible, we have to become increasingly conscious and to pay more attention. So that's it. 3 cognitive technologies, spirits, divination, and ritual, developing alongside extractive technologies to help people navigate deep uncertainty.
Thanks for that, Nicola. There was a comment by Brian about how most mathematicians understand the models are not reality. Yeah, 100% agree. So this is the interesting thing I see is that it's when it escapes those who really know, right? The mathematicians or those who are working in insurance or anything like this, when it enters into the public sphere, I think what we're dealing with here is a tendency of all of us who are outside of that space to glom onto those ideas, to the graph, to the chart, to the estimations. Like there's a sense of the known. And if I think about it, and just to contrast with what you were saying, Nicola, I think a great deal of, even in like enterprise sales and things like this, like the ultimate idea is to, perturb their fear of the uncertain, but then you provide them with a degree of certainty. And, that's what gives them that soothes their anxiety. So it feels like there's almost like this gravitational pull that we have towards certainty. Even people who talk with great deal of confidence, right? Like the original, what was it? Like the original name for the con men was confidence men, right? So people who just speak confidently, it's really tempting to hear. But I'm interested in those bones that you talked about. So a technology, so bones are scattered on the ground, or maybe they're entrails, or maybe they're coins. And then you said in that space, it leads to, what is that? It holds people in that uncertainty longer for novel sense making, or what does that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, it can do it. People traditionally, when people threw bones or attended a bone throwing, so as I said, it's public. It's people wouldn't trust people who go off and do it as a transaction one to another, because that's a bit suspicious. Why would they be doing that on their own? They're probably up to something. So this has changed over time because obviously with colonialism and globalized capitalism, we have a very transactional society. So that's what it's become now. You know, you can be a diviner or a Ngoma practitioner or a Sangoma, and you can sell your services. And that happened to some degree, but generally in public. And so what you're doing is you're recognizing that the ability to detect risk lies exactly in the fact that people come together with different experiences of reality, with different networks, with different jobs, with different ways of thinking, different modes of perception even, and they're contributing their views. Now, everyone doesn't just talk at the same time, because that would be just a mess, right? So this is a ritualized process. So what they'll say is when the diviner will say something, because they're looking at the patterns, traditionally people will always say the same thing, "Siyavuma," which means we agree, we agree. And you can stand on the side and you think, well, what? Why do they all agree? Like, it's all. I mean, is the diviner like brilliant or something? You know, he or she just seems to know. No, they're just saying we agree out of respect to the spirits, but they are conveying their degree of agreement in their body. It's an embodied response. So if they say several and sort of look away, they're saying, yeah, not a great, description of what's going on based on my experience of reality. And everyone's doing this at the same time. And the practitioner is tracking it. And so what he or she is doing is honing the story every time. So it's not a makeup thing. It's a whole bunch of people working together through a ritual process to get a little bit closer to the truth. And I'd love to pick up on your point, Antony, that you made earlier, which is, we seem to have a gravitational pull towards certainty. And I think that's really, really true. And I'd love to hear other people on that, which is this whole idea of that for me is when things are certain, it's very easy to make decisions. We don't use much energy, cognitively. There's no load. But when things are uncertain, we really have to work hard. And we are evolutionarily honed to try and save energy, particularly that kind of brain energy, because it uses a lot of it.
I see that a lot, working in and around exec teams or other areas in the team. You will find people who are stressed out, no bandwidth, and there is a pressure to have the answer. That's why you're paid, right? You're paid to have the answer. That's the expectation, even though people up top say, no, it's okay. But there is this kind of unwritten rule that, hey, you're getting paid the big bucks to kind of have answers, and bias towards action, which drives things. And so when you're really trying to work with groups to tease out very complex problems in very nebulous, vague, uncertain circumstances, some people find it slow, they find it exhausting, they find it confusing, and they beeline for answers. And you can kind of see people collapse the uncertainty, get to an output, and just drive. They want to drive to an output, no matter what the output is. I think we see a lot of that in the business world too, with the kind of the tech startup, move fast, break things kind of attitude, and also with the answers. So there's always time for action on, be it climate, society, and of course the total entanglement of this. But there was something there that you said about embodiment, got me thinking. I did 1 year of Gestalt psychotherapy, like training in it, and I'd love to go back to it. One of the big points in all of that was, one key thing I got out of that was I live in my head. I'm very much of that. There's not the embodiment, right? So very cognitive, and I think that's look. I may be at one end of the spectrum, but I don't think I am. I think there's a lot of people who operate. What did Sir Ken Robins say? They think of their bodies as a vehicle to take them to meetings, to take their brain to meetings. So I'm curious about what embodiment means in your context, and what role does that play?
So I think there is, and it's not a premature convergence, which I think you're talking to as being quite dangerous, but I think we're recognizing now more and more in complexity science, in cognitive neuroscience, even in sort of computer type sciences, we're honing towards this idea of what's called 4E cognition, that cognition is at the same time embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. So cognition isn't something that takes place in our brain. So I think this is kind of generally known now as we come to understand more about how we think and decide in the world. And this for me is very pertinent to how we work with risk and how we work with uncertainty. So there's some really great chats. We must explore those as well. So for me, embodiment is just recognizing that whether you feel embodied or not, there's a whole lot going on in your body, all around your body, that is impacting your cognition. And probably sort of 90% or even more of what we decide, our body's decided it for us. Our history has decided it for us. So we think we're making sense of things rationally and analytically. And that's a sort of delusional thing that feels, again, very safe because we'd hate the idea. I mean, I think most of us, again, who've brought up in North Atlantic cultures, hate the idea that our history and our body is deciding stuff for us. And so we really kind of push against that, I guess. But embodiment is, for me, what happens when you don't mind anymore and you just begin to recognize that. And if you want to, you can train it a little more. You can train your intuition. Anyone can. It's really, really easy. And within organizations, it's a bit harder because the whole word intuition is considered to be a little bit dangerous because it's, intuition is not seen as a cool thing. But for me, embodied cognition is exactly that. It's just a far more intelligent way to make sense of reality when there is no one right way, no one right truth, when it is inherently uncertain.
Well, I would say to a lot of people, a lot of the words that you're using would sound very dangerous to people, right? So divination, embodiment, the intuition, these kinds of things, they are the antithesis of the rationalist approach to things. So I'm wondering, is it a thing? Is this something that we need to learn? Or so when I say we, I mean people of my ilk, of my kind of heritage that have been steeped in scientific rationalism of a time and an era. Is it stuff that we need to learn, or is it more a case of unlearning?
I don't know. I think it's both. I mean, yeah, we can definitely unlearn the assumptions that informed our very narrow idea of how we think and act in the world. I think we can unlearn some of that. But generally, I think a lot of the things we learn are useful. We've just got to find the right place for them. And if they kind of flood our understanding of reality, then it's kind of stupid. So, I think pretty much all learning has context. And if we can put what we learned into its relevant context, we're having an intelligent approach to learning. So I'm not big on the unlearning kind of approach to life because I think you can't, frankly. Once you know it, and it is going to impact you. You can just make that impact smaller or bigger. So you amplify or you don't.
Because, I mean, you wrote about it in your book, the bit that I could read when I got the preview on Amazon. This idea, and, we've spoken about it before, like indigenous knowledge has been rising in interest, but also with that has, I feel a tension there. In the one hand, I mean, I'm deeply curious. I definitely want to know more, right? On the other hand, though, I also feel, maybe I'm not allowed to because this is, requires secret. There's a great deal of, I don't want to say secrecy, but I want to say that, there's, I don't know, information integrity that's maintained, right? Like, you just, like you say, you don't just allow information, valuable and powerful information out into the world without context. And unfortunately, when this stuff gets into popular culture, it becomes cheapened and it's thinned out and co-opted and corporatized and all of these issues. So there's is there hope for heathens like me? As in how, on the one hand, there is this risk of, I guess, what we call cultural appropriation or glomming onto some cheapened New Age version of indigenous knowledge. At the same time, it seems our dominant frames are still very weird, and by weird I mean Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so, if we need to, if people are scrambling for a need to maybe come to terms with and live better with, uncertainty. I'm curious about what options are available, like how to go about that, because even in the spaces that we operate, you say the word complexity or systems thinking or something like that, and you can kind of watch a lot of people's eyes just glaze over, like they're like, oh no, that's too much, keep it simple. So yeah, I'm curious, what is there for, or what are your thoughts for average North Atlantic heritage people like myself who live in rationalism to step out of that?
I mean, I don't have this heavy kind of binary, right, between all these kinds of people. I think we're in an incredibly rich time where conversations are happening across things in very nice ways. At the same time, as that sense of worry and as you put it, the sort of scramble for oh gosh, we better find a better way. As that unfolds, I think we do get into quite a dangerous space where cultural appropriation takes place at scale. And we see it, and it's going to happen, and it is happening, and it's all over the place. And so, if we're wanting to do something useful in this space, we've got to develop our ability to be a little bit more aware of when it's happening. Do we even know? Because a lot of people who haven't explored in any depth at all what science is in any culture, right? They just assume, oh, this must be science. It's the thing we were taught at school. So we haven't even, gone into what is science and what is philosophy, or what is how might these approaches to cognition be different? We haven't kind of bothered to do that. We're wanting that easy fix. We're wanting someone to really package indigenous knowledge nicely for us. Well, of course, it's going to happen. We live in a capitalist society where the desire for something neatly packaged is going to be followed by something neatly packaged. And we would be really silly to sort of assume that wasn't going to happen. So we can go into that and run with that, but it's really, kind of doing the same thing. So we're reenacting that same colonial pattern. I mean, one of the ways I think that is very useful, after 90% of indigenous knowledge has been destroyed, right? There's a small amount of it left. We can sort of sit back and watch the rest of it getting packaged neatly and destroyed in effect, after the case, under the guise of inclusion or under the guise of decolonization. Sadly, this is really possible. Or we can really start getting to grips with what decolonization actually means. What does it look like in our own context? Because it's going to be different. If I grew up in South Africa, my understanding of what decolonization looks and feels and smells like is going to be and needs to be very different if I, grew up in the UK or in Australia or in the US. It's going to be different. There isn't a one neat list of the risks of decolonization. So we've got to go into it. We've got to do the work,
Because it does seem that there is. Really, sorry, keep going.
I'm done.
Oh, look, I do think it is a very precarious time. We're already in it, where we know that when there is a great deal of uncertainty, when people perceive a lot of risk, this is where the rise of populist leaders, autocrats, those who are, the certainty merchants, will rise to the top. Those who can provide some rock solid, picture of the future, which is often just a vague mirror of the past, right? Trying to take people back to their childhood, make whatever you want great again. And so I think unless we are able to get a whole lot of people thinking like being more comfortable with uncertainty and being able to tolerate it, then to me it seems natural that what we will find is a rise of the autocratic strong man, strong woman leaders who, and the rise of dictatorship and the division and the breakdown that comes with that.
For sure. That's happening in lots of places. And again, with that risk comes an opportunity to see it better. What they like to call, I think, the Overton window, right? So when there's a war going on, and people are starting to get information about that war that is making them very curious about maybe mainstream news channels, right? That opens that Overton window, that possibility, that sense that actually maybe the assumptions I made before are not useful. And so I think that's where we are right now. Yes, we're seeing the rise of populism, and we're seeing the rise of something that has the potential to take that populism down at a level it hasn't come out before. It hasn't been there before. So I agree, a very exciting time, very dangerous time. We've got to be very, very wide awake eyes here. I would say this is an old it's a Bushman greeting in Southern Africa. People will say, "Are your eyes nicely open?" It's a way of greeting, saying, "Hello, are your eyes nicely open?" Melissa just picked up the book there. Yeah, it's a way to recognize that we have to have a kind of openness of the senses in order to make intelligent decisions. And if we agree to dumb ourselves down and slide into the comfortable space of populism, which is not going to be comfortable forever, it's just a kind of temporary comfort because it feels like it doesn't challenge our fundamentals. If we're going to do that, then we've already lost. It's just going to be a nasty slide from here on. But if we say, oh, and this reality, which is very interesting, is going to lead me to act in a slightly different way, right? And for me, this is what Trump does. That's why I do genuinely think he's got an upside. It is about a time when we go into new ways of being, new ways of engaging. We ask new questions. We attend different webinars, and we start engaging. This for me is exciting. It's no guarantee, but it's certainly increasing.
I think that's a great segue to open it up to the crowd around new ways of thinking, new questions being asked. So let's throw to the crowd. I'd like to see, I guess my little question there is to everyone here, like, what's bubbling up in you, new ways of thinking that you're seeing in yourself or others around you, and the new questions that are arising.
That'd be great. I see there's questions from Anal, there's questions from Melissa.
There's heaps.
I haven't, just please, let's just throw in what feels right.
If you just grab your hand, who wants to go first? I know I see Andrew, the two Andrews as well. So feel free, just if you can indicate either with your hand or the technology hand.
Otherwise, we'll keep warbling.
All right, Stephen.
Steven Seagal.
Thank you. I guess my concern, so let me say my background, I'm a philosopher and psychologist. And my particular area of interest is anxiety and different kinds of anxiety and the relationship between anxiety, uncertainty, risk. And I guess I'm wondering, how much this discourse on uncertainty and risk embraces different kinds of uncertainties. Not all uncertainties are of the same type. They're very different kinds of uncertainties and very different ways of working with uncertainties. And I guess I'm wondering so I think that perhaps I'm coming from quite a different paradigm, and so I'm kind of very aware of kind of bringing another paradigm into this discussion. Um, but it's interesting when we speak about decolonialization, because part of it does mean being able to work across paradigms. And part of that is kind of embracing what some authors call the anxiety of the strangeness of the other. Um, and it's how do we work with the strangeness of the other in order to get beyond binaries between of the same and other. Anyway, that's my little rave for now. So I'm just seeing how to open questions of, uncertainty, different kinds of uncertainties, and how do we work with them? Thanks.
And Stephen, just one little follow-up there. Just you mentioned different kinds of uncertainties, so I'm curious, just to help imagine what you're talking about. Can you give us like a couple of types of uncertainty that you're talking about?
So I guess just for a start, there could be objective uncertainties. So objective uncertainties are all those uncertainties that are kind of outside of us and they're located in particular kinds of situations. So I think that talking about predicting and manipulating uncertainties would kind of fall within an objective uncertainty. Then there's also subjective uncertainties, and subjective uncertainties are those kinds of uncertainties in which you feel the world, the what do you say, the carpet being swept out from under your feet, and you have no ground or foundation upon which to stand. And so you really don't know how to read the world in a state of subjective uncertainty. You've got no tools for reading the world and for making sense. And I think that a lot of colonialization, uh, when they called Africa the dark continent, for example, centuries ago, uh, there was kind of the darkness was not in Africa. The darkness was in the European colonial mentality, but the European colonial mentality didn't really work with that darkness. It just projected it out onto the African. And I think we're coming to a time now where uh, we colonialists, and I'm a colonialist, are needing to come to terms with our projections. So, in other words, to work with subjective anxiety, not just with objective anxiety. And then there are a whole array of other uncertainties as well.
I can respond to that a bit, Anthony, if you like. Yeah, is that okay? So I mean, thanks, Stephen. I think that's really, really useful, and I think your word anxiety is very useful because on some level, if we're not feeling anxious, we should ask why. There is a sort of a necessary anxiety about the external reality that we experience, so about what's going on in the world, for example, because it's not looking very good right now. So that can induce a kind of anxiety. And yet anxiety is very useful because if we weren't feeling it, it would be because we were very cut off from the potential consequences of what's going on right now. And they are stark and they are quite dire. At the same time, if we have that thing, what you call like internal or subjective uncertainty, as you put it, we are missing our ability to make sense of things, actually, because we've cut it off too much, perhaps. And I think you described that quite well with the colonial mind, where we are unable to see reality because our models and our assumptions about what is right or what is better get in the way.
Yeah.
If you look at traditional people or many indigenous people, they see that as a kind of a sickness. And it manifests almost invariably in anxiety if you become conscious of it in context. So many of us who have this sickness that means we get to be diviners or trained as sangomas in Southern Africa, we have anxiety that goes through the roof because we are struggling to make sense of a very weird reality that seems to have taken place around us. And it is not that that anxiety is taken away, because that's what would happen in a North Atlantic, Western scientific psychological situation. You would probably go on antidepressants. They would decrease the anxiety to the point that you could now work with some of your issues, which is, kind of very logical. But if you look at how indigenous traditions often work with that anxiety, they'll put you in a ritual context, which is very contained, very, very safe on the outside. And then they will do things to increase that anxiety to radical degrees. And they'll see what happens. Not because they're being stupid or sort of backward. They're doing it because they know that anxiety has a place. It's useful. And they're trying to work out why it's there. And they also know that your mind has the ability to break through that anxiety. Not everyone. If there's a difference between those who can and those who can't. But most of us can. And once you break through that anxiety, you've got into a new place where you're able to see reality in a different way. This is very, very useful process, which, is just not going to be part of our conversation if everything needs to be made very, very safe, psychologically safe or, medically safe, etc. So I don't know. It's just a different way of looking. Anyway, there's a question from Andrew as well.
Yeah, but if I can just add one little bit to it, Stevie, you lit a light bulb of a conversation I had with a psych a while back. He said, if we look back in time, people didn't have an understanding of what was going on all around the globe, or these large-scale issues. And generally speaking, the planet was reasonably stable, all in all. So your uncertainty was really down at the micro state, right? Your day-to-day living, that was the challenge. But now we've almost inverted it in modern developed nations anyway, is just that actually my life's pretty safe. On the micro, my life is pretty stable. Whereas I'm suddenly aware of these large-scale uncertainties and large-scale risks. And so I think maybe that's part of it. Timothy Morton talks about them as like hyperobjects. This idea that we're obsessing on, like, we are bombarded with news and issues that are operating of things that are incomprehensible in time, in space, in impact, and they're intangible. And they occupy a great deal of our thinking, whereas on the day-to-day, and so we spend our time worrying about these things that we really don't have a great deal of. There's not much agency that we have around them as opposed to our private life. So, but anyway, so thanks for that, because I think there's something to be said for greater specificity about when we talk about uncertainty. Andrew, somebody, Nicola, you're going to call someone out. Was that Andrew? Or was it
I was going to, maybe
first?
just one thing, Anthony, I don't think that sense of personal safety holds for most of the world, to be honest. I don't.
No.
Yeah,
No,
I don't
agree.
think it does.
Yeah.
I think it holds for a small part of the world.
Correct. Yeah.
But yeah, Andrew had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Great chat. I was convening a session recently where the group sat down and somebody said, well, we live in a very complex and complicated world. And then another person said, actually, we don't. The world's very simple. It's just we make it complex and complicated through our actions and our incentives and the things that we do. So I wanted to put to both of you, in the spirit of the world being complicated by us, and it could be much more simple. Do you have do you have an idea about one thing that each of us could do that would make the world a little bit more simple in the way we view our place in it and our connection to it and our actions in it, that would break down that complexity rather than add to it? Is there one ritual, one idea, one heuristic, one thought that you have that we could use as a reference when confronting complexity to make things a little bit more simple? Thank you.
Anthony, are you going first or should I go first?
You go first, Nicola.
I don't know either. Thanks, Andrew. So is there one thing we could do to make the world simpler? I mean, I think the world is simple in many ways all the time, and it's just about what we focus on. So, you know, we can make the world simpler by narrowing our focus to what's more immediate. And if it's a teenager, then we failed already, you know, because they are not simple. So there's so much layer in where complexity lies and where complicated lies and where simple lies actually in our lives. I think what was very helpful for me was to begin to look at a framework from very much the North Atlantic tradition, but it's also emerged in a critique of the current paradigm. So Stephen, you would go with that, I guess. And that's the Cynefin framework. So that for me was very, very useful, because what that framework does is it shows that there are clear things that are relatively simple, highly ordered things, coexisting with things that are complicated, just more objects, but still ordered, coexisting with complex things where things are literally entangled, coexisting with chaotic things. And to be able to know the difference and to just gently introduce ourselves to telling the difference and becoming aware of the difference all the time is incredibly useful. So this is a very simple framework in a tradition that is very available to me, because I don't come from Ngoma cultures. I studied science, as in sustainability science. This framework for me was extremely useful. Not only did it allow me to make better sense of my reality and my work, it also enabled me to understand Ngoma culture a hell of a lot. So, and I don't think there's one way, but that was certainly one, my experience.
It's weird. I was about to mention the Cynefin framework too, and it came off the back of a conversation I had last week, talking to a professor of risk, and he said, and I said, "Oh, complex this, similar in your line of questioning, Andrew." And he said, actually, what he notices is people tend to oscillate between either reducing things, almost like dismissing the complexity of things and trying to make them simple, or they swing to the other end of the pendulum, that it's all chaos.
Yeah.
And so sitting in that middle spot, I think that's the uncomfortable thing. And I guess that, there's a little story there as well. Like my background, bit of psych, but mostly ecology and these kinds of things. And I remember coming out of university, thinking we'll be fine. Like, we've got some bad news coming down the pipeline, but we'll be fine. I'd lived 15 years in developing nations, embedded, and I think it was about week 2 where I was like, no, we're not getting out of this, because too many people, it's just people trying to improve the quality of their lives and climb out of it. But, for me, that was like probably about a 10-year long dark night of the soul, thinking, human nature plus the biophysical demands means we're not going to climb out of this. But then I ended up working in the mental health space, talking with a psych as well. And he said, interesting, you've kind of globbed onto doom as your certainty, right? So it's better the devil you know. And so even though I said, it's going to be chaos and misery, actually that wasn't embracing the uncertainty. That I'd wedded myself to a sense of certainty. And I wondered the degree to which people, we wed ourselves to either the optimistic or the pessimistic in these things, and holding that middle. But really, to get back to your point, Andrew, the only thing I got is that serenity prayer to know the difference. To what is it? To know what you can change, accept what you can't, and be able and have the wisdom to know the difference. Rod?
Yes, I just wanted to throw something in there to take a few steps back to what Nicola was saying. So similarly, obviously, I come from my background, my ancestors is North Atlantic culture, but I was trained in Ngoma culture since I was a child. And just to add a layer to what Nicola said about it, in terms of divination and ritual, and Nicola started off talking about the spirits. The point I want to make about the spirits is that they are the spirits of one's ancestors, quite specifically. And I think what's important about that is so the divination and the looking at the bones is the assumption that the information is coming from ancestors. Many of the bones, in fact, refer to specific ancestors. And the idea behind it is that everything that happens to us has happened to people before. And because of that, the ancestors know what to do because they've experienced it before. So, indeed, while divination does not predict the future in African culture, it certainly explains the present with the attempt to reduce the anxiety and the uncertainty. So, what I'm saying is that the way to reduce anxiety and uncertainty in terms of Ngoma culture is by appealing to the past with the principle that everything that happens has happened before. You know, the Western half of me practices as an astrologer. And while some people might think, what the hell, an astrologer in the 21st century? The point is, for me anyway, what astrology is about is exactly the same thing. While it does attempt to explain the future, which is arguable, the assumption it makes is that what happens in the future is similar to what happened in the past. So using the planets as cycles of timing that, however accurate or inaccurate that may be, that is actually the principle behind it. So I'm in the end saying one of the ways that we as people, using tools like divination or whatever tools we might be using, one of the ways we can reduce anxiety or attempt to reduce it is by referring to the past and saying, because we've been here before, if we take the advice from the past, we can reduce the anxiety. And that, I think, is what Ngoma culture is trying to do.
But I think that's fantastic. It's really, really useful. And I will add on to it as well. So when people who are again brought up in a Western culture, we could say, hear the word ancestors, the immediate assumption is biological. And that is true. And that is the first level of ancestors people will learn in and be trained in. And different cultures within Ngoma, there are many, many lineages that work in very different ways within this Ngoma broad set of Ngoma practices. It's a very large knowledge system. And its science is developed in lineages. So some lineages will really focus almost exclusively on one's biological ancestors. And those are easy to understand because that's granny and grandpa. And, it's basically people in your family that have died. But when Ngoma cultures began to experience more disrupted realities, which takes place when we start to extract, which takes place when colonialism happens, which takes place when we start to go into war. Because if you take extraction to its logical conclusion, you're almost inevitably going to get into war at some point because you're going to use up your resources and then you're going to start looking around at your neighbors. That is the beginning of large-scale wars. Now, it wasn't the experience of local reality, really large-scale war. So if you go back thousands of years, wars were little small things that happened. They were skirmishes. But as we began to build in Africa empires, wars started to get a hell of a lot more consequential. And we can look at today just how consequential they are, potentially for the entire world. And so what happened was Ngoma cultures are very adaptive. And what happened at that point was ancestors became something more than biological. Of course, we had our biological ancestors, and those are the closest ones to us. And we generally assume they've got our personal interests at heart because it's granny and grandpa. But then we have entanglements. The fact is, when we go to war, or when war happens, things become disrupted. What people say is the spirits are displaced. So everything has a vital spirit. And now you have a war, you have large-scale disruption. Large-scale disruption, even just from a radical technology, right? Like even AI, maybe. You have radical disruption. It displaces the spirits. And what people say is those spirits then roam around freely and they can afflict. And when spirits afflict us, they kind of connect into us and we begin to feel them. Now that is going to spike anyone's anxiety. You suddenly feel like there's something around and you don't know why, but you don't feel like yourself. Okay, so this is not unheard of, you know, in Western psychology. But this is a very interesting way that the understanding of spirits, this understanding of an animist way of life, then developed and changed and in effect innovated into new kinds of technologies for working with new kinds of spirits. And one of them is exactly that, war ancestors. What spirits emerge and what spirits afflict us when society goes to war. So there's an entire discipline, large lineages of Ngoma culture that work specifically with that. And that of particular lessons, I think, increasingly for reflecting, as you say, on the patterns of the past and potentially present and future. Comes in, if anyone wants to.
So I'm very keen to open up to more voices in the room. And now you had a lot of comments, and including some of your studies around uncertainty. Andrew, Brian, Rossi, Elaine. So don't you want to just put up your hands or just ping where you are? And it would be really great to get your insights. And now, do you want to start? Because I can see you there. But please.
Yeah, it's a really great session here, like listening from all of you. I have been working on uncertainty for the last 5 years, and what I have realized is like the fundamental problem in the uncertainty space is like we always tag uncertainty with the risks, but in real sense, those are totally different concepts. So why that I have been recently reading on that, and what I have realized is like all our tools and frameworks and everything, even the definitions, like our uncertainty definition is tagged up with the risks. So why is that? Is like for the last 100 years, from night and all the way to the economics and all the way to actuarials and then insurance and everything, risks is the way they talk and they can manage things. But uncertainty, when it comes to uncertainty, they can do nothing. So what I feel like is like is it the time we need to separate risks and uncertainty and start discussing uncertainty separately, and to come to the point of how they understand the people who are making decisions, who are giving fundings, who are giving allocating, who are doing insurance and everything. If we have a different tool or framework just for uncertainty, how good it would be. So just throwing up a spin on this discussion. And then other thing is like we are just discussing here deep uncertainty, but for me, risks is one part, uncertainty is another part, and deep uncertainty is going towards the unknown space, like a Rumsfeld diagram, this unknown. So maybe this is how we can do. I don't know, like just, but a lot of great minds are here, so just throwing this spin here.
Well, you got my vote, Anal.
Thank you, Anal.
Yeah, I love that very much too, Anal. And I think perhaps you've put your finger on one of the critical differences. And I think this is very useful, right? To see the differences between perhaps, aspects of indigenous science and what has become, the more dominant science, or an entirely dominant science across the world, which is that for me, when I started to get a little bit of an understanding of indigenous science, it was very much about this uncertainty. We never spoke about risk. We didn't speak about uncertainty either, but it was just not the lingo. But we didn't encapsulate anything in what is the actual risk, because for me, risk is always subject to where I am right now. In other words, is it a risk for me or my family or my tribe, etc.? So we can kind of name a risk. Uncertainty it feels to me more diffuse, more difficult to work with. And so in a way, the tools that I began to realize were very useful, but difficult to bring into the boardroom or into other contexts, were very much uncertainty-based tools. And I think now listening to you, maybe that's why it was so hard for me to bring them into the boardroom, not because it was spirits or divination and that's not available, but these tools are quite like what Stephen said. They're coming from a different paradigm where uncertainty just is, right? And we live with it. And this is how we are. So I think that's incredibly useful. And thanks for sharing your paper. I saw you did. Great. I'll have a look.
Exactly. Yeah.
Go on.
Exactly. The point is, all these tools and all these frameworks and everything we have is based on risks. So it's very hard to push uncertainty discussion into this sphere first. The first difficulty is like when you go and talk to the people, uncertainty, oh, okay, you are quantifying risks or something, and then all the discussion and this paradigm changes and all this discussion goes to the different direction. So that's the main challenge that I have faced all the time. Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah.
I've had a similar experience now. I used to work in the psychosocial health and safety space, right? So that's risk. There was this passage from Tyson Yunker Porter's first book, Sand Talk, and it goes something like, we don't have a word for safety in any of the Aboriginal languages because we can't provide that. What we can provide, however, is protection. I've got your back and you've got mine. And he says it's a lovely way of being in the world, in that instead of aiming for safety, you're aiming for mutual protection of one another. And so he described it as being more agentic, whereas safety being more passive and protection being more agentic. And I thought about that, and it's far more, there's more reciprocity going on in there as well. So anyway, thank you. Alan, you've been waiting very patiently, mate.
Can I also just, say, after Alan, can we hear from, because we're in our last 20 minutes, I'm just aware of time, and Joan, I think you made a great point, and Elaine, voters, do you want to also come in? So go ahead, Alan.
I'll try and be quick. Last weekend, I was in a place in southern Africa looking at cave paintings by San and Khoi and looking at the difference between the Khoi paintings and the San paintings. It's just purely by chance because it does relate a little bit to the past, obviously. So I'm sort of trying to be multidisciplinary. And in doing so, I'm trying to write a book about gifting as a human relational, ingrained, neurological, dopamine and oxytocin-based driver for human relations and how they work. And I'm trying to do that over long historical time. So I do start with Homo sapiens emerging along the southern coast of South Africa, etc., and reasons for that, through to today, where I'm really getting stuck because there is so much going on in the gifting space. It's become philanthropized, it's become industrialized. But the point that Antony was making about I have your back, you have mine, that is a very hunter-gatherer type of relational basis because you need each other. That has become eroded by big man, big girl, what Antony was also saying, asset building because of adopting essentially an agricultural livelihood base, building assets, and controlling power. So my sort of take a little bit is one of the things that we're not being explicit enough about is time. What time frames are relevant for which type of uncertainty? This generation, the next generation, the generation after that. That's what I'm personally at the moment stuck of how I'm the last chapter, which is chapter 10, which I hope to start soon, tries to look to futures but purely speculatively. But how many futures, what duration of futures am I going to try and talk about? This generation, the next generation? So what I'm missing a little bit in this discussion, people are not being clear enough about what time frames they have in mind when they're talking about risk. Risk of being bombed now, risks of your children not having work, because increasingly with AI, there is, so labor is surplus to capitalism. Capitalism doesn't need labor anymore. So if you don't have an income, how are you going to live? So what time frames are relevant for these discussions that we're having? Ancestrally, it's sort of easier, I suppose, because that's happened, but I'm not trying to predict what's coming next. But it seems to me there's a missing element, or we take for granted time. And I'd like to be a little bit more explicit about risks, how long. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
I think it's great.
A few
Should we
comments
just
and
move
then
on and get other perspectives? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I can
Angela?
comment. Yeah. I mean, okay, I will make a short comment then. There's just, you know, absolutely, totally agree with your comment there, Alan. And my experience again is that it goes, you know, I can think about the long term, but I'm increasingly worried about the short term. And, you know, what that might mean is, you know, on some level, is my kid going to be okay, you know, today at school? To, you know, when is the temperature in Cape Town going to get so hot that I'm going to, you know, see people that I know around me dying, you know, in droves? And that's not, you know, very, very, very far into the future, potentially. You know, we're looking at maybe the next 10 years, depending on where we live in. So I think it's a critical point, and I think it must become part of our discernment and our thought.
Angela, over to you. You need to unmute.
Sorry,
So
am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think I just want to come in. So my name is Nhlanhla from South Africa. I'm Zulu, and you know, just hearing the conversation about divinations, ancestors, etc., and risk and uncertainty. One of the things that I'm very concerned about at the moment, personally, and this may not necessarily be an academic thought, but it's more around risk versus ambition as a Black person in South Africa, in a sense that personally, I'm very traditional. I'm a very traditional Zulu man. There are certain traditions that we practice, slaughtering, etc. And these do not necessarily have anything to do with the Ngomas. Perhaps my great-grandfather can come in a dream and say, hey, dude, you know, the last time you slaughtered was many years ago. And for us, this is a very deep spiritual reality. And so then you have this ambition to move into suburban South Africa where, you know, we're very globalized communities, and then you get criticized for practicing whatever belief that you have that creates certainty in the world you're living in, that sort of moves away from risk. You know, I'll give you very simple examples. If a person had to pass away in a private hospital in South Africa as a Black person, there are rituals we do to sort of bring their spirits back home from wherever they passed away, because we believe that their spirits would be lost if they pass away outside of their homestead. And if you are not able to do that, it then creates risk either for yourself or for your children if that particular ancestor is not taken care of properly, if their spirit is not taken care of, you know, carefully. And so then there's the globalized world, but also there's these very deeply cultural and traditional realities that one lives in. And this creates uncertainty in a sense. And you even look at the way that our education system is, you know, it's like you're ambitious. You want your children to get the best education, but at the same time, what does it do to our belief systems and our way of being as a people? And this creates a lot of uncertainty for me, at least. I do not speak for all South Africans or all Zulu people, but this is just when I, saw the topic around risk and uncertainty, I thought, well, there's also this paradigm of ambition and risk, being Black in a globalized world.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's when it gets personal and it gets granular in the way you've just described, Nhlanhla, it's real, and it is what we see all the time, and it is in many respects an unintended consequence of trying to work out how do we govern in this post-colonial world in South Africa. We don't want to erase or continue to erase cultures, and yet that is what is happening. We might even be trying to learn from indigenous knowledge and unintentionally, be placing lenses on it that unintentionally erase it. It is so difficult. It is so ambiguous. And I think everyone who tells a story is part of trying to get a little bit of an improvement about how we're doing it. We've got to do it better. So thank you.
Joe?
Hi. First of all, thanks. This is a really interesting conversation. I'm relatively new to the uncertainty, risk, complexity, and so not 100% sure on if there are distinctions and where those distinctions are between them. However, when I sort of see people operating within the kind of complexity space, one of the things that quite often takes me by surprise is how some of the sort of best known voices in the space, they can come across as remarkably certain about their particular framework. And so I find myself often wondering whether an uncertainty framework is an oxymoron and or a paradox. Now, that may not be a bad thing, right? That might be the point. Maybe I'm missing something. My understanding of Taoism, yin yang, is it's not about opposites. Like the paradox is the point, right? But anyway, my question is the search for a framework or a tool to somehow understand or clarify uncertainty, is that in itself a quest for certainty and somehow an avoidance of the uncertainty? I don't know. I'm interested to know what you think.
Anthony, you want to kick off or shall I?
I love that, Joe. Like, it's something I see and wonder about a heap, right? There are the commercial realities of this stuff. People, if you come in too nebulous, you're not going to be able to get anything off the ground. So you've got to start somewhere. But it goes bigger. There's this lovely thing, which is Blaise Pascal's sphere of ignorance, which is, as we know more, we actually just get the surface area of our ignorance grows as we expand into the infinite questions of the world. That's something that is at the base of science. That's something at the core, and science in and of its, like, when I talk about science, I'm talking about sort of scientific revolution came out of Europe. But that in itself is built on the premise of doubt and falsifiability, what we don't know, right? But look at how it turns. So I had that perfect experience. I studied science for many years at university. I also studied some humanities, and one of them was philosophy. One of the subjects, my favorite, was the history of the scientific method. And it was the first time I was ever taught about what the hell science is and how it evolves. And then when I'd go back into the science departments, my science friends sounded a lot like religious zealots to me. There was a certainty. So there just seems to be, I think this is almost like this is the eternal game, right? We just end up reifying we end up reifying and making things solid. I don't know if it's the eternal trap.
I'll put in 2 seconds because I'm really looking forward to Joe, and who's been writing a lot. Thank you. Joe, it's a brilliant question. And I think we have to find frameworks. And I think we quite naturally do find frameworks, which doesn't mean we naturally write them down. I think we do try and frame things in order to understand them. And I think to some extent, oral cultures have an advantage over illiterate cultures, because as soon as we write our framework down, we are somewhat more at risk of mistaking our frameworks for reality. And that's the danger. It's not creating frameworks. We all create ways to get little handholds in uncertainty. And so Nhlanhla and Rod have been talking about spirits. Well, spirit genealogies are a framework. It is a way to get a little handle on this uncertainty. But we don't mistake, spirits for reality of a given situation. It's a lens, it's a perspective, a way to hold on to it. But we very pragmatically try and work out how to work with them better. And that requires relationship. So it's a little bit different to the kind of very much sort of literate frameworks that we do love and promote around the world. But great question. But Joan, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I loved what you said, Joe. And I had talked about something similar in the chat earlier, because I think I was really intrigued by the topic, deep uncertainty and the grammar of risk. And what do we mean by deep uncertainty? What sense making? There's so many different sense makings about uncertainty. And I think what we need to consider is there's the uncertainty that is about, I can't know the future. I cannot predict or control a complex emergent system. But that kind of uncertainty versus I'm not sure uncertainty. And I think, Joe, what you're sort of highlighting is there's an uncertainty about us not being certain. That's a different form of I'm not certain myself. And people being, invited into these two distinctive kinds of uncertainty. I think there's like an implicit thing become that uncertainty means something forward-looking versus something that's absolutely present in how I'm making sense of the world, or we are making sense of the world right now. And I think that uncertainty, being not alive to our own uncertainty, our own possibility of not being right, is much more creating risk for us.
Yeah.
So the risk doesn't sit as something outside of us, as something that is coming that we can't know. The actual risk, paradoxically, is somewhat being created by us emergently, because we are so unaware sometimes of the uncertainty that we should be in, but we trick ourselves into belief that certainty is what we need. And so the certainty becomes the antidote to uncertainty, but actually that paradoxically becomes our risk. And I think putting in what I've been playing with for the last 30 years in organizations is how do we use organizations as the containers for putting in rituals and practices. So I love the Ngoma rituals, because I think there are those that we can put into organizations, organizational rituals, organizational practices, processes, infrastructure, uncertainty infrastructure, which allows the system to hold that uncertainty. I think that is necessary. I think organizations have this purpose. We should use them as these developmental containers, because we can't rely on individuals developing the comfort or this knowing and being in their own uncertainty alone. I think we have to think about creating and I love the grammar of risk, because grammar is a set of rules. It's a set of containment. And so what is the grammar of uncertainty that we can build into our organizations that can hold the uncertainty of being us, I think is a very important exploration.
Beautiful. Thanks, Joan.
You just struck something for me there, Joan, as you always do. I was at a breakfast with the minister, and we're doing a big build on water infrastructure in Victoria, and obviously very arid country, here in Australia. So, and I could see the tension from people. But on the one hand, big plans for the next 30 years, and this word of adaptation and resilience. And I was like, okay, but there really was this need for a big plan. But I think it came from Roger's paper, but I ended up just writing down these words. And it says we need to move, I wrote down, we need to move from prediction to preparation, as in optionality. We need to move from probabilities to possibilities. And we need to move from models to imagination. Yeah, so that's just what stirred up when you mentioned that.
I know.
Yeah, just to answer to the Joe's question, I'll give the example. If I don't understand English, how can I come and listen to you guys? So it's the same way, all the people out there, they don't understand the language. Like they only understand the language of RICS at the moment. So we need to have these uncertainty frameworks and tools. That's their language. If we have this, and then they will also start talking about this. So it's not like we need to have that at any cost, but to make the people who understand only RICS, only understand quantification of RICS, and then reducing uncertainties, we need to have something so that they also understand it's fundamentally different. That's the only logic that I want to bring here. Yeah.
I love it. And I mean, in such a nutshell, it's for me about learning from each other and knowing that that's extremely difficult when we've got this kind of othering culture. That's very important. And also not developing frameworks that we declare to be universal and fit other indigenous things in those frameworks, because the frameworks hold the power. And so, no, sit things alongside each other. And when we're coming from a culture that says, well, that looks weird, or that doesn't look right, just wait a little bit longer until you start reflecting on why it looks weird, right? Because that's probably something about you and your ability to see and the particular science in which you've been schooled. And we forget that. We think that, oh, let's learn from indigenous knowledge, like it's a big invitation, to indigenous people to suddenly become part of the party. It's like, no, it's people who don't recognize their own perspectives being limited in a way that provides filters to being able to see reality. It runs across all of these things. It runs across risk and uncertainty and the difference between them. And I think we've really touched on such a small part of where this could go. But for me, it's a very exciting conversation that I think should be deepened over the next many years, months, weeks, and days.
Well, I think you just tapped into Stephen's point about the uncertainty or the anxiety of the strangeness.
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll need to get weird then.
I'm going to say thank you hugely to Nicola and Antony for leading this and for catalyzing this whole conversation in response at the very beginning. And for people who did ask the questions, we will share the recording and summary notes from this discussion, including the chat, because I see it was a very rich chat with everybody.
Yes.
And in keeping with the way open dialogues evolve, there is interest, obviously, to expand this, and we can certainly do that. And Nicola, Antony, we can look at who else and how else you might want to do that. But thank you, everybody, for coming. And if you aren't following us, I have put the link in the chat. Please do. The fact that you registered for this means you'll get next invitations and the recording of this. But these are open dialogues, like an open glossary, and made in the collectiveness of who is in the room. So Antony and Nicola, thank you. And everybody, thank you for joining today. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Nice to meet you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks for engaging and conversation.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.